Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
The anti Israel protests in America last year were not spontaneous, but organized. Who were the groups that organized these protests? What do they say they want? And what do they really want? We discuss this today with Ryan Mauro, who is an investigative researcher at Capitol Research Center in Washington, D.C. He is the former director of intelligence at the counter-extremism organization Clarion Project. Ryan, welcome to our show. It's awesome to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Ryan, you recently published the report Marching Toward Violence about the groups who organized the anti-Israel protests in America. Why did you investigate these groups?
Well, part of it was just because it's my job, because I'm an investigative researcher for Capitol Research Center, and they monitor all the politically involved nonprofits. And so my tasking when I was hired was to focus on a lot of these extremist groups and anti-Semitic groups. And so this naturally fell into my purview. But the approach was extremely comprehensive, and I had a particular approach towards collecting evidence and understanding this because what was unique about this is that it seemed to be more of a movement as opposed to a flash in the pan outrage over a particular incident. And I knew that there would be bad guys involved even before this became a thing. Because they always do get involved. So I was expecting there to be a diversity of groups, and then you have some bad players exploiting the situation. But what I found was, to my surprise, was that it's pretty much from beginning to end and all in the middle. Extremist groups that want to destroy Israel, that support terrorism, and that sort of thing. Uh, I can't think off the top of my head of any groups that support a two-state solution. That said, well, I can think of one that said there should be a permanent peace with Israel after a Palestinian state is created. No, these groups are pro-violence, pro-terrorism, as we say in the report. And I counted over 150 of them. There's many more, but those are the ones that seem to pop up the most often in terms of the college campus protests, but also protests across the country that are rowdy, destructive, and concerning, as opposed to quiet protests that are done legally on a corner somewhere.
Let
So
me just ask,
150 groups.
but are
Yep.
these groups a discrete, meaning separate, or are they taking their marching orders and making a play off marching toward violence? Are they taking their marching orders from a overlord?
The answer is kind of yes and no, I think. Because there are power dynamics in any coalition, there are certain players that are more influential than others. And so you would assume that behind the scenes, when they have conference calls and that sort of thing, there'll be people that are giving out marching orders, then others that choose to accept them. I don't know to what degree they can actually coerce people to go along with it. But it seemed like every radical group, especially those that have registered nonprofits, if for no other reason than fundraising, wanted to get involved in this. And that's why you had groups that had nothing to do with the Middle East situation ever jumping in. But that's due to social pressure, pressure from groups around them, and it's a good fundraising ask. I'll be interested to see how people's salaries increased probably over the past year when those documents come out. Marching orders not so much, but there are ideological marching orders too. Also, because the majority of these groups are pro Iran, like the Iranian regime. They're pro Hamas, not just condemning Israel, not just calling for an end to the genocide. And all. I mean, like they celebrated October 7th on October 7th, that type of thing. And so there's an ideological affinity for these groups. So there is some degree of direction because they're loyal. They choose to be loyal to these nefarious forces.
So, can you give us a general description of the groups that organize the protests? Who are they? And how many groups, 150 groups, how many people are involved?
Well, it's certainly thousands. if you expand to include the protesters that are involved, I mean, then you're looking at tens of thousands. But there's so many groups involved in this, and there's a lot of overlap. One person will be on the board of three organizations, then have their own, and that's partially by design, I believe, in order to give the appearance of this massive wave of support coming from all these diverse areas. But then you look at them, and it's, they're all kind of interconnected. Certainly when it comes to fundraising and that sort of thing. But there's basically two factions of the protests overall. There's the one faction that's kind of this union of Islamist extremists that support Hamas, but they're more like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is actually more popular overall, it seems like, among the Muslims that are involved in this type of thing, because they're Marxist-Leninist, they're communist. And so that just has more pull in the American context than jihad would and Islamic theocracy. So you have Islamists, like I said, it's like a fusion of the Islamists, Hamas, and then the communist PFLP. And then you have the straight up, consistent, self-declared Marxists, communists, and anarchists. And they're all one thing right now, operationally speaking. You really can't distinguish. They have disagreements, but every alliance, there's disagreements within NATO. It's still one thing. And then the other faction, which is not as involved in protests, but they do a lot of protests, not so much on college campuses, aside from harassment and spreading leaflets, that sort of thing, are the white nationalists and generic, so-called far right. I don't love the far left, far right terms in that binary, but for lack of a better term, far right types that are white nationalists or just hate Jews for whatever reason and align with it. So that's the makeup ideologically. But then operationally, in terms of what specific groups set things up, the group that is the backbone of all of this is Students for Justice in Palestine, which is to a certain extent basically a branch of American Muslims for Palestine. And American Muslims for Palestine is made up of these known Hamas fronts. Like they've been shut down for prosecution, they've been sued, easy to show. And then there aren't a lot of details about the relationship here, but there's enough to know that they do training of activists, have provided funding. There's a lot going on there to where Students for Justice in Palestine nationwide on all the college campuses is you can consider them to be one thing. And the reason that's important, aside from that, it's good to know who's behind all of this, and they're the biggest force by far, I think, is that yes, it's true when you look them up, they support Hamas. They celebrated the October 7th attacks on a national level, meaning it wasn't just one crazy chapter on a crazy college campus doing this. At the top level, they were saying this was a good thing. And so that got a lot of negative attention for that, and people focus on that, but it's actually much worse. If you look at the document that they distributed to their supporters right after the October 7th attacks happened, yeah, they supported them, but you read a little bit further, and what they actually say is that the resistance group that carried out the attacks, they were a part of them. That's Hamas. So they didn't say Hamas, but a lot of Hamas devotees don't say Hamas because most people don't know this. Hamas is an acronym for Islamic Resistance Movement. So every time you hear them praising the Islamic resistance in Palestine, praising the resistance, they're actually using the name for Hamas, just not the acronym. And people will sometimes draw a distinction there, like, oh, they're just talking about this vague concept. No, they are talking about a specific group. And the language of the document that Students for Justice in Palestine put out, I mean, makes that very clear because they say the resistance group that did this, the October 7th attack. So there's no wiggle room with semantics here. And they even reiterated, they said, we are not saying we support them. We are saying we are them. Actually, here's the quote. We as Palestinian students in exile are part of this movement, not in solidarity with this movement. What that means is that you have self-declared members of a foreign terrorist organization as designated by the U.S. State Department being allowed to operate while they call themselves Hamas on college campuses.
And get tax exemptions and they're nonprofits, right?
Yes, and they also know how to hide that as well. because they will run. There's this arrangement called a fiscal sponsorship arrangement, where you have a registered nonprofit that can loan its status to an unregistered group that aspires to at least one day be its own nonprofit. But to get them up and running, you can go through a registered nonprofit, so that you can do things like the record keeping, get donations. And it's primarily so that you can get donations, and then the organization, the fiscal sponsor, usually takes a cut, say 10%, 7%, whatever. And then it goes to this other group that then has no paperwork. Like, you can't type in Students for Justice in Palestine and see like what the foundation and the grants that are going to them. No, it's the money goes to this other group, Westpac, WES PAC, and then they take the money as the donor wants it to go to these various groups, one of which would be Students for Justice in Palestine. And so there's no transparency, there's no board, there's no national leader, there's virtually nothing can be known about them.
Do you have any idea what is the source of the money for Students for Justice in Palestine?
Well, we know American Muslims for Palestine has provided some funding in the past. There are some foundations, I don't have the list in front of me, that have given tens of thousands of dollars in clumps to Westpac that has reportedly been intended for Students for Justice in Palestine. I forget which organization it was, but of the amount that's known, it was actually minuscule. So we're not even able to say the majority of the funding comes from this place. You'll know the source.
Okay. So Ryan, what you're saying is that the protests that we have seen on campus in the past year in America, and though there were many, and they were very aggressive and sometimes violent, that this is mainly organized by an organization that declares itself part of Hamas, which is in America designated as a terrorist organization, and therefore, I think, not allowed to do this, to have these protests on campus. Is that correct?
I mean, that would be more of a legal judgment. So basically, if an organization is a designated foreign terrorist organization, as Hamas is, it is illegal for an American resident or citizen to provide any material support. So you can vocally support them. That's probably would be the defense of supporters of Students for Justice Palestine. So that was just vocal support. That's why it's so important that they're saying, no, we are them, because you're not allowed to recruit for the group. That's material support. You can't set up memberships. Technically, you can't spread propaganda. You can express support, but you can't be like part of a propaganda apparatus, creating content and that sort of thing. So I would argue that the most logical conclusion, I mean, you look at the definition of what material support is, I think all of this falls under it. Because if you're spreading Hamas propaganda while saying you are Hamas and you're creating content and that's pro-Hamas, like that's all recruitment activity, that's material support through propaganda. And they even say that they operate essentially at the direction and control of Hamas. That's who they're loyal to. So I would assume that some good prosecutors, if there was will at the top, could go after this organization. I mean, obviously not, hopefully not just, student protesters that don't really know what they're doing just got wrapped up in it. But officials that are actually making this happen. I would hope that the Justice Department would look at that. But in my experience, most people, including most experts, most law enforcement personnel, they know Students for Justice Palestine is problematic, that there's a tendency towards violence and destruction. They don't know that they say they're Hamas. That's not really well known. So I don't know if the conversation has even happened at the Justice Department level, the FBI level, of, hey, look at this evidence. What do we do with it?
Wow. And Phyllis, do you think that the American Jewish community knows and is aware of the fact that Jewish students were targeted basically by Hamas in America in the past year? Do you think there is an awareness of that in the Jewish community?
Absolutely not. I think
Unbelievable.
that American Jews, I've been doing, Evelyn knows a lot of research about the lead up to World War II and the Holocaust. Absolutely not. I think we're as bad. Well, okay. We are in the midst of having our heads in the sand.
Mhm,
For many reasons, because we hope that it's different, but we're just not willing to recognize what's going on.
mhm,
And we're
mhm,
not willing to recognize that it's not the Jews, the famous quote by Martin Niemöller, democracy in America. It's what my grandparents, not Evelyn's, but my grandparents fled the czar from, came to America is at huge, huge risk. And in fact, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about what these groups say they want and what they really want, of the three groups, what do the Marxists say they want? To destroy America? Is that what they say?
Yes, but because everyone's paying attention to the contentious Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as it's called, I don't even like that terminology because is it really Israel versus all Palestinians? I don't think so. But it's yeah, the Marxists will say they won't say destroy America, but they will say the U.S. has no right to exist. They'll say they refuse to even call it the United States, just like they refuse to say Israel. They say Palestine or Zionist state. It's now popular in among these groups, but really I guess you call them the far left, like people who wouldn't identify as communists or Marxists or anarchists, but are just kind of in that ecosystem and getting drawn in. That it's like fashionable now to where there's people like it's a cool thing to say, I don't recognize the US's existence, so I call it Turtle Bay or Turtle Island. And the reason they do that is because there's this old myth that the Native American tribes all recognize North America as Turtle Bay or Turtle Island, um, because the world was created on the back of a turtle shell. So there's something out there. But to them, those are the indigenous people. This is their land. They called it Turtle Island or Turtle Bay. So therefore, um, or yeah, just Turtle Island. That it is should be called that. Like it just stays in that place. Now there raises the question, obviously. I mean, Native American tribes would conquer each other and get kicked out. So like, whose land is it? But they don't really think beyond that. They just think the European white men came and they conquered it, and that was horrible. And they committed a genocide, and therefore America is an illegitimate state, just like Israel's an illegitimate state, and therefore it is legitimate to destroy both of them.
Okay. I want to get, I just want to say this one sentence. Every time I think about this, and I think of 1984 and Brave New World, I can't get past, do they think about the day after, that if it was a Marxist society, they would have to give up their cars, they would have to give up their huge TVs with Netflix. I mean, I just can't get past that. I don't understand.
That conversation doesn't really take place. It's this very utopian vision. Some of the real diehards who really identify with this and they're like kind of nerds about it, like they enjoy reading the literature and debating it on this really detailed level. They're like miniature philosophers. They really get into it. They'll have answers for that. Um, but basically, it comes down to a utopian vision that out of all of this chaos, something beautiful will arise from the ashes,
Oh, from the ashes.
because capitalism and the imperialist government is upholding America's mankind's evolution, essentially. So once that's destroyed, no matter what happens, we'll be able to evolve forward now.
And that destruction, is that, if it's up to them, gonna happen democratically or revolution in a revolutionary way?
Revolutionary way. There's some that say there is some that argue for some incrementalism. Not so much like the leaders of these groups, but you'll see if you go into their chats and stuff, there's some people that are like, yeah, I don't know about the violence thing just yet. But they'll all agree that violence has legitimacy. They have sympathy for it. They support it. Yeah, but whether they want to actually go that far, there's a tiny group that want to be a little bit pragmatic about it. But the vast majority of them, especially those that are specifically involved in these protests, it's all revolution all the time. And they call themselves insurgents.
And how popular is this movement? I mean, this sounds, you talk about the size of thousands of people. You talk about an ideology and a vision that is, I would say, very much in the margins, or is it really popular?
It's hard to say because there isn't comprehensive polling on this
Mm.
nationwide or especially on college campuses. So you kind of have to look at polls related to extremism and then infer based on their behavior, what the proportions are. But we know from different polls about a striking amount of anti-Semitic type tendencies among Gen Z. Um, Basically seeing the Jews as like this privileged class, and if you're privileged, that means you're oppressing other people, because that's the only way to get there. I
In
saw
their
a
view.
poll.
Yeah.
What's that?
In their view, it's the only way to get there.
Right, I'm paraphrasing them.
Yeah, I know.
So,
I just wanted to.
yeah, thank you. And so I saw a poll recently where they asked, was it, yeah, it was all American ad adults who are likely voters. It was something like, do you agree more with the statement that Hitler is entirely evil with no redeeming qualities, or Hitler had some good ideas? Choose one or the other. And under the age of, I think it was 29, about 21% went with Hitler had some good ideas. So uh,
Trust me,
there,
they wouldn't have been able to name the ideas, but they would have still voted.
right, because it seems like that, like the Gen Z, like they hate the idea of judging anyone to such a degree that their impulse is, oh, there's a statement saying someone, even if it's Hitler, is all evil. Nobody's all evil. Everybody has something good about them. So I'm going to go with this other one. But when you're actually choosing that and you're consciously saying, oh, well, Hitler had some good ideas, that's an indication that there's a pool for these guys to recruit from. Nationwide, there was a poll in 2017 that said 8% of American adults support Antifa by name, and then 8% support white nationalism. We keep coming around to this number when you look at polling data about whether you think your state should form an independent country, leave the United States, how you feel about patriotism. Just across the board, we keep running up to this figure of about 20%, I would say, embodying extremist ideas, and then like 8% that go exceptionally far with it.
So, in your report, you describe that there is there are these radicals at the core of this movement that is organizing these protests, but there is also a kind of an outer circle where many people join these protests while not really belonging to this revolutionary core. Is that correct?
That's right. And so that was part of the reason I did the study too, is because I have most of my social circle by far would identify as Democrat, liberal, progressive. But then from my professional circle leans the other way.
Mm.
And so it's great for me as an analyst. I love it. Because I don't get overly wound up about this. To me, it's all just a puzzle. Give me all the data from everybody, all the interpretations. Let me just see how I can fit it together. I think that helps give me a leg up over some other people that are screaming their heads off about these issues, you know? And so I had a certain degree of sympathy for college students that are going there, and then like now their videos of them at these horrible protests are going to be around for the rest of their lives. They're going to have consequences, and they're just like ignorant kids that are probably going there because their friends are there, they don't like genocide. So what's the risk in going? So there are a lot of people like that. But if you look at the ones with the bullhorns, the people that are putting out the memes and the advertisements, the people that actually do stuff beyond just show up, there is this very radical core. And then as you broaden out, then you start involving the organization. So basically, to lay it all out, what I did in the Marching Towards Violence report, the conclusion I came to is that there were really kind of four concentric circles within this anti-Israel extremist movement. And I emphasize extremist movement because I left out, like if you're just anti-Israel or you disagree with Israel, you're not part of my examination. So we're talking about like the worst. And there's basically four concentric circles where you have an outer circle, then you have a smaller circle inside of it, and you go 4 layers in. The outermost circle is the one that's the most risk averse because they have the most political power. They have connections to politicians. They care about popularity. They're in the media a lot. They give legitimacy to this movement. They speak in coded language. They won't, well, sometimes they'll endorse Hamas directly, but usually they don't. They'll say they condemn terrorism, and people will say, "Oh, well, good for you. That's great." And then those of us that study this know, well, to them, Hamas isn't a terrorist group, but Israel is, so it's meaningless. And so those groups kind of form the coalitions so that when they put out a statement or anything, they can say, look, 300 organizations agree with us on this issue. And look at their names. They have human rights in there, and justice, and Middle East, and all this stuff. And you think, my God, look at this diverse group of experts over every conceivable field. Everybody agrees on this. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with 250 professional groups. And so that they feed off of that and they form this coalition again that's very overlapping. And so that's what the outermost layer does. They're careful they don't want to delegitimize themselves by being too radical. You go a step in, and the slightly more radical ones are those that will finance and put together protesters while actually glorifying and sometimes assisting their illegal activities, whether it's just violating an ordinance. Some go so far as glorifying attacks on police. But they always demonize, especially the police and of course Jews, anyone that comes against the protesters. If the cops have to come in because the protesters are damaging property or they're refusing to leave and they didn't have permission to be there, and the patience of the university has run out, and the cops come in and they try to gently, if they can, disperse them. Oh, it's a giant crackdown. It's a massacre. Human rights abuse. That's what these groups do in the second circle. And then as part of that second circle, there are a handful that are really slick with how they support violent protesting. What they'll do is they'll hand out these guidebooks, you could call them, that have resources, how to answer questions, how to make the case for your position, different resources, how to prepare so you're as safe as possible, how to handle police, all this stuff. And then it'll say something to the effect of, for more about this, go to this URL. And it'll be something about organizing protests and protecting yourself that you could get from a multitude of places. But the URL they give you will be to like a militant anarchist site that when you go there, that URL may just be talking about organization and how to talk, how to handle multiple people at once, management. But they'll see right in the sidebar that there's instructions on how to fight police, how to light things on fire, how to seal doors shut, all this militant stuff that, just like if you went to an Al-Qaeda website, Inspire magazine or ISIS with their Dabiq magazine, you go into this is similar type stuff that you would find. And so that's a decision that they made. Like that to me is not a mistake. When they're sending resources from an anarchist group called the Ruckus Society, and these other sites that advocate violence and have those instructions, they chose the URL for a reason. They know what they're doing, but they do have a little bit of deniability for those that don't want to see the truth. The third circle in are the groups that want to escalate all this. So they do everything that the other groups are doing. They support it, but they go a step further in that they say expand the protest, get more violent. They're trying to incite people. There's groups linked to China, the Chinese Communist Party, involved in this, like the People's Forum. They actually had something like 100 activists go to their New York City offices just hours before they rioted at Columbia. And during that meeting, they were basically telling them to riot. They were saying, replicate these other protests, and they were pointing to riots. And then guess what? The activists went and did it. That was linked to the Chinese Communist Party. The People's Forum is basically financed and run by a guy in China. So they're trying to escalate. And then the fourth circle, that's the smallest but the most dangerous and the most quickly growing, are those that blatantly say they want to dismantle or destroy, using those words, the infrastructure of capitalism and Zionism and the military-industrial complex, and whatever catchphrase that they have. But it means ripping apart the government and then replacing it. and having anarchy, whether it's local or whether it's national, whatever. Just do what you can to get an insurgency going. And they will argue that they are not terrorists, they are not extreme because, hey, they're not like ISIS and Al Qaeda that want to kill anyone anywhere. You know, they may not agree with massacring people in a city square and shooting them all and hitting them with your car or anything, but they will still support attacks on police, especially if they have any type of training relationship with an Israeli. Anything that they consider to be Zionism. I mean, that can apply almost anything. Capitalism, the military-industrial complex applies almost anything. And so to that audience, these guys aren't so bad. They're different. They're closer to being freedom fighters than ISIS and Al Qaeda. They're not just madmen that want to massacre everybody. So they actually, one magazine that this circle put out actually said at the end, after explaining that they need to stop talking about Middle Eastern issues, they have to align with the anti-police racial justice cause so that they have longevity for when the Middle East issue goes away and they can still rally together and then pop back up when the issue comes back. The magazine ended with freedom for Palestine means death to America. So they're telling you.
Yeah, they're not, but we're not listening. So
Right.
if we were listening, what can be done about these groups? And what can our listeners do instead of just listening to this podcast, shaking their head and sticking their head back in the sand?
There's so much you can do. I think the most frustrating thing about this line of work for me is that, yes, the threat is so severe and it's escalating so quickly, and the current track leads to a very pessimistic ending. Um, I've said this before, and it may sound hyperbolic, but when they talk about defeating and destroying the United States, that is achievable under the right circumstances, causing enough civil discord that the country is essentially paralyzed, and then states start saying we need to be on our own, or the Republican states and Democrat states say we can't live with that other political party because they're all just inherently bad people. Like that can happen. So I don't think it's crazy when for them thinking that there's a long-term trend in their favor. Everything else is crazy, but that part I don't think is. Um, but everything else, this could be reversed so quickly.
How?
There's no reason that this should reach this level. And here's how. On the government level, the easiest thing really would be for the IRS to just take away the nonprofit statuses of groups that are engaged in criminal activity.
Exactly.
Which most of these are. So it's not because they're anti-Israel or even that they're anti-Semitic. No free speech issue. According to the IRS code, if your nonprofit is conspiring its leaders and one of your purposes is to engage in criminal activity, even if it's violating an ordinance, you no longer get tax exempt status. You can exist as an organization, but you can't get a tax deduction for being financed. Take it away. And that also delegitimizes them because then when you Google their results, everybody realizes that this happened, and it makes it a lot easier for reporters and people to know who these people are right away. That's the single biggest thing that could be done very rapidly. Don't need legislation or anything like that. There's other things like designating groups that are operating overseas as foreign terrorist organizations or foreign criminal organizations. We go through a lot of the federal stuff, but I know for like you and the people that listen to your podcast, they want to know what they can do. And there's a lot. When you're just reading about this stuff and you see an organization named, maybe just create a list or an Excel sheet or notes on your phone, who it is. Go to Influence Watch, which is run by the Capital Research Center. And that's where there's documentation on these different groups, most of them. And go there and then you'll find out the truth about that group. Then look up the reporter. If the reporter mentioned this group and did not include a very relevant fact like they support Hamas, contact the reporter and very nicely just say, I would appreciate as a reader if you included this, or I thought you might need to see this. If they don't respond and you feel comfortable doing it, shame them on Twitter a little bit. Just say, hey, tweet at you because I don't know why you left this out, you know? But always start with kindness. But if they're rude and they're not paying attention to you can ethically get more aggressive. I would say that's very big because reporters, we have to have some sympathy for them because they are massively overworked. If you know any reporter, you have friends that are reporters, it's not a great life. Like it's you would think it is because they're doing, cool stuff and me, but you don't have much time to dwell on the cool moments because you're moving
Mhm.
from one thing to the next because they're so overloaded that they have to just quickly get through. So if they're reporting on a protest, okay, we'll report the groups involved. They're not going to go the extra step of saying, well, let me research and vet this group as if I'm a
Exactly.
counterterrorism activist or researcher. It's just, but if you get it to them and you make it easy, then it's very likely, I think that a lot of them will say, that's relevant in the future. I should do that. So I think that type of activism is very substantive and people can do things like that. If you're able to raise a little bit of money, you can give it to nonprofits like the Capital Research Center or or like Clarity Coalition, these groups that are involved in this effort and doing the work that you feel is most substantive and actually doing things. That makes a huge difference. Um, Besides that, I would say, sharing the content in your social networks, saving the Marching Towards Violence report, and saving your time of getting into a contentious argument that leads nowhere. Just give it to people and ask their thoughts. You don't have to lecture them. Like you don't have to get into that. Don't spend the time and turn it into a contest of I'm right, you're wrong. Just here you go.
So, will we be able to include the link directly to your report on the bottom of this description? Where
Sure.
can they get your report?
Yeah, it's at the Capital Research Center website, which is capitalresearch.org.
Okay, but I think well, I'd like to, okay, fine. So we just wanted to make it clear that they could get it easily to share.
Yep, yep. And then the other things would be if you have a contact, most people out there, especially if you're watching this, you've forgotten about some of the influential contacts you have. Someone who knows somebody. Literally take 5 minutes, no more than that, and scroll through your phone, the contact list, and then write down who you can contact and share the report with, or connect myself or Capital Research Center with, or you just reconnect with, and just see, what can be done. Maybe they need information. Maybe they're up to something. Someone has an idea. Just a lot manifests itself. If everyone were to pool together their contacts and think that way, we'd be just miles ahead. Instead of just operating in our own silos, because there's so many times, I'm sure you've experienced it as well, where all of a sudden you're doing a project, you're into a difficulty, and it goes off to the side, you get stuck, and then like much later you find out your friend that you're talking to about it, their step brother was a senior government official in charge of legislation related to the issue, and you're like, how did you not think of that? So yeah, you empower yourself enough to understand that you can make a difference. You probably have contacts and talents that you're not remembering or focusing enough on to think about how you can make an effort. But we don't even need that many people, I think, in order to make big changes. It doesn't have to be you just get some dedicated small number of people, you can make a huge difference. If you know anybody at the IRS,
See,
and the
that's what
Treasury Department,
my husband's a tax attorney. Exactly what I keep thinking. I asked him the other day, why doesn't the IRS do something? So to me, that's where to start, really,
yeah,
bringing these groups to the attention of the IRS.
yeah. So much of it is who you know, not what you know. In this case, we have what you know, some of who you know, but I think a lot of it really does just come down to those personal relationships that people have.
I think that's excellent, doable action. Do you have any last words that you can encourage people to do? And as we end this really fascinating discussion.
I would just encourage people to follow Capital Research Center on social media. You can follow myself as well. Go to the website and sign up for the newsletter at capitalresearch.org. You really want to do that because social media, the algorithms are just, it's unbelievable because I have right now 43,000 followers and I put out a tweet and sometimes just like dozens of people will even see it. So
Yeah.
you're not your favorite organizations that you want content from, good chance that you're not receiving what they put out.
Yeah.
We know. We know. So anyway, thank you, Ryan, so much for this talk,
Thank
really,
you.
in discussion. It's been so valuable. We thank our listeners for listening. Those of you who would like to know more about Evelyn and myself and our other projects, go to Never Again Is Now podcast at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And please, as we end every podcast, we say, speak up against anti Semitism and all hate.